Rodriquez.
Well, thank you very much. I will ramble on here for several moments to give people a chance to sit down. I will say that I'm used to people looking over my shoulder. It's generally not me. But I'm going to learn to live with this, I'm sure. It has sort of a Wizard of Oz feel to it. Well, I want to thank everybody for returning back from lunch. I hope you enjoyed lunch and the opportunity to mingle and talk with each other. And I hope that some of you had a chance to enjoy the many marvelous exhibits here in the Academy of Sciences. I think we're very fortunate to have this as a setting for today's conference. This afternoon, we're going to be switching our focus from understanding the nature of climate risks to exploring more proactive solutions to reduce these risks. I was pleased recently during an interview that I conducted with some members of the media where they were talking about the conference in Durban and the frustration with the fact that many people felt more should be done. And it was very, very rewarding to be able to tell people about all the things that we're doing here in California under Governor Brown's leadership to address global warming. Now, this morning we've learned that the threats and risks from climate change are very real. But this afternoon we're going to learn that there are many, many solutions and actions that we can take so that we're not only protecting the state's populace, its businesses, its communities, but these are actions that can also they have the potential to provide jobs and help us prosper as a state. To help us frame some of these solutions, we have a video here that provides examples of some of the innovative climate solutions that are taking place in California today.
California, ISO, manages the electricity in the state of California. As part of that monitoring, they include the weather, wind patterns, temperature patterns, even droughts can have a significant impact. Even a few degrees on a hot summer day, if we miss the forecast or something changes in the weather, can really begin to stress the system. The more renewables we have in the portfolio, the more critical that will become. We're going to have more renewables. This function is going to be essential going forward.
Our primary objective is to plant shade trees for direct shading and to reduce the ambient temperature in urban areas. When you reduce the ambient temperature by maybe 1 or 2 degrees Fahrenheit, you're reducing indirectly our electric load. So it's a resource that competes with supply-side options. Instead of building a power plant, we are saving energy. Public in general can do their part. They can plant more shade trees. They can install or retrofit rooftops that have a higher solar reflectivity. It's basically all of us doing small things. All of us contributing marginally, incrementally, but going in a positive direction. In the long run, all of us are better off.
The California Emergency Management Agency is the lead organization for preparing for and responding to disasters. In 2006, we had an extraordinary heat event that resulted in a lot of deaths, and that really prompted us to develop a better plan collectively with the other agencies involved, whether it be the power and energy providers, the state agencies that are responsible for the health and well-being of the most sensitive populations, the agriculture community, as well as those who protect animals and pets, as well as the first responders. The plan is in place now, and it's something that we exercise and utilize on a regular basis in hopes that we don't have an extreme heat event, but we're ready for it if we do.
If you look at the last 24 years, here in the city of Napa, we have flooded 9 times. Prior to that, in a twice the amount of time, a 48-year span, we only flooded 7 times. The thing that was different in the 05-06 flood was the fact that areas that we had never experienced flooding before flooded.
What's unique about this project is its approach to solving flooding problems using environmentally sensitive flood protection methods rather than just hardening and concrete. Came up with a solution that would meet everybody's needs, first and foremost for flood protection, that we would get 100-year protection, but we would restore the river, we would restore the habitat. I think a lot of other places could probably use the same sort of technology and the same sort of methods for flood protection.
The California National Guard's Joint Operations Center has the capability to see everything in real time. So we're monitoring the weather, monitoring the traffic, economy, communications, everything that can potentially affect the state, we're watching. So 3 personnel are in here 24/7 for the most part. And when a disaster does hit, we have a quick reaction force of soldiers and airmen that are prepared to go directly to that disaster within a certain amount of hours. When there was over 3,000 different fires in Northern California, this Joint Operations Center, we could see exactly where the fire perimeters were. We could see where they were heading. We can lean forward and anticipate the effects and how they're going to affect those local communities. We can anticipate the resources that will be needed, so we can look, if we have it within the state, we can give the first responders a heads up that, hey, this is likely going to be an area that's going to be affected. Every day is a new day, and we're constantly, always ready and always there to provide assistance.
We have about a 250-acre project. We've tried to really push the envelope on innovation. And one of the biggest innovations is creating a net zero community which creates as much energy as it consumes over a year. But just having a made-up project that's one example on a university campus was not our objective. So that's why this is delivered by a private party, a private developer.
If you and I are both developers and in 10 years' time, I have a net zero bill and you're now exposed to wherever California utilities are in 10 years' time, I'm thinking I'm a little bit more valuable than you are.
It had to make economic sense. It had to make sense in terms of rents. It had to make sense without university subsidy. So what we wanted was a project that could be replicated in cities across the country and across the globe, not just Disney Tomorrowland. This is the real thing.
Well, the examples that you've seen in the video just now are only a handful of the many efforts that are underway around the state to address the problems presented by climate change. But while our focus is on protecting California, it can't confine, or we can't confine our interest to just the borders, because climate change doesn't observe borders. National and international leadership is required to tackle this global problem. Thankfully, we're very, very fortunate to have leadership in the Obama administration that understands the significance of climate change and the challenges presented by climate change, and it has demonstrated that it is committed to taking action. I'm very pleased to introduce one of the key leaders in the federal government in the actions that the federal government is taking against climate change, Nancy Sutley. Nancy serves as President Obama's environmental advisor and the chair of the Council of Environmental Quality. In these roles, she is central in charting the nation's direction of climate change initiatives. And in keeping with today's theme, which is California leading the way to address climate change, I'll mention that I'm proud to say that Nancy is an alumnus of Cal EPA, where she served as a deputy secretary from, I believe, 1999 to 2003. So I hope that you will all join me in warmly welcoming Nancy Sutley.
Thank you very much, Secretary Rodriguez, and it's certainly an honor and a pleasure to be here and to join all of you today. And a great thanks to Governor Brown and his staff and all the agencies who've been working on this conference. I think it's, of course, very timely, very important, and really important to have this kind of engagement from a state like California and from the leadership here in California. And there's no doubt that that in a state like California, which has been such a leader on climate change mitigation, that we should also see California stepping into this leadership role when it comes to adapting and dealing with the impacts of climate change. The President and the Obama administration recognizes that climate change is one of the greatest environmental challenges and maybe one of the greatest challenges we face as a nation and as a planet. And certainly this challenge has a number of dimensions. First, how can we avoid the most serious effects of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas pollution? And second, really, how do we prepare the United States for the impacts that we're unable to avoid? And the thrust of this conference is focused on how we prepare for the impacts of climate change. But I think it's important also, as you have, to spend a few moments talking about the importance of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we believe and find it's important to remind people that a critical component of our energy and climate policy is to reduce emissions through smart investments and smart strategies on clean energy and energy efficiency, and that will help us a great deal. And as a country, we made a historic $90 billion investment in clean energy, which has already doubled the capacity of the nation to produce renewable energy. And we've been fortunate in our partnership with California and with the automakers to put in place new fuel economy standards that will double fuel economy and that will reduce carbon dioxide pollution by more than 6 billion metric tons. And I think that that is an incredible achievement and really one that would not have happened if not for the leadership of the state of California. In some other areas at the President's direction, federal agencies, the federal government is the single largest energy consumer in the United States economy. Federal agencies are on track to reduce their direct greenhouse gas emissions by 28% by the year 2020. And clearly, as you know, there are international components to this issue. And last week, the United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties on Climate Change has concluded. And this new Durban platform is actually, fortunately, I think, moving us closer to a future regime for reducing emissions that will fully apply to all major players. And that's the first time we've seen that kind of agreement, and we think it's a significant achievement for these talks. And in the end, I think everyone agrees that the United States played a constructive role in bringing that about. And programs, of course, here in California under AB 32, including emissions trading, are important models, both nationally and internationally. And as the state sees, it's expected to prompt substantial new investments and technology innovation by establishing a market signal that I think we all want to see, where clean energy is the profitable kind of energy. These state efforts are essential in helping the United States move forward, and we welcome the leadership from California. But even as we continue these efforts to mitigate climate change, we know that some climate impacts are already unavoidable. Preparing for these impacts will help to reduce climate change risks and damage for people and communities across the United States. And climate change, as you heard, is already affecting lives and livelihoods around the country and around the world, whether it's as a result of rising sea levels, changing agricultural conditions or more frequent and severe weather events. And California is all too familiar with wildfires and floods and droughts and other natural disasters that are expected to become more severe as global temperatures shift. And you're not alone. 2011 is already in the record books as a year of historic extreme events. One of these new records is the number of events that have totaled at least $1 billion in damages. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, in 2011, there have already been 12 extreme weather events that have each caused at least $1 billion in damages. The previous record was 9, set in 2008. The aggregate damage from these 12 events is over $50 billion, and the economic losses are far from the full picture. More than 1,000 people died in these disasters, more than double the national average for any year. Each of these events is a huge disaster for victims who experience them, and collectively they're an unprecedented challenge for the nation, for the safety of our citizens, for our economy, and for the societal stresses that they produce. But what does this tell us about what we can expect and what we should be planning for? This has been an unusual year. Is it just an anomaly? And what are we seeing across the years, and what might we expect in the future? And this morning you heard from Dr. Pachauri about the IPCC and its special report on the risks of extreme events and disasters. And the IPCC, a credible scientific organization, says that we can expect more extreme events. So it's hard to say that any one of these disasters that we've experienced this year is a result of climate change, and it's sort of hard to predict exactly what the future will look like, but we're getting clear signals about what the impacts of climate change could be and what we need to do to be prepared. And I think that it's hard to imagine that it's prudent to assume that the future will look like today. That's why in 2009, by executive order, President Obama made adapting to climate change a national priority. And I co-chair an interagency task force that's charged with developing recommendations for how the federal government, through its policies and programs, can better prepare the United States to respond to the impacts of climate change. From the federal government's perspective, the adapting to climate change is simply responsible risk management. Preparing for extreme events expected from climate change will help us to minimize human suffering, and particularly for the most vulnerable among us. It allows businesses, communities, governments to reduce the long-term costs of responding to climate change impacts. For example, a study by the Federal Emergency Management Agency shows that for every dollar spent on disaster preparedness, the government saves $4 on disaster response. And in these tough fiscal times, that's pretty compelling math. Adaptation means better use of public resources to make sure that our investments of public dollars make sense in the long run. And this is true at the very local level, such as in the small coastal town of Plymouth, North Carolina. The town is replacing water pipes that have been in place for more than 100 years. They want their investment to last another 100 years, and they're working to account for inundation and other effects of both sea level rise and extreme weather events in their new plans. And a recent survey of nearly 400 mayors from all 50 states found that more than 30% are already taking climate impacts into account in their capital planning and improvement programs, and that, I think, demonstrates growing local concern about climate risks. It's these types of practical decisions that are made every day in every sector, that have to be informed by the information that we get from the IPCC, from federal agencies and others, as well as from our own experience with extreme events that we're already seeing. And many of these decisions will be made at the state, local, and community and tribal level. And the federal government does have an important role to play, and our agencies are stepping up. In its October 2010 report to the President, the Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force that I mentioned before recommended that our adaptation efforts be based on several core principles, including adopting integrated approaches. We don't want adaptation to be a standalone endeavor or an afterthought. We need it to be integrated into the decisions we're already making every day about economic development and infrastructure investments and disaster risk reduction and natural resource management. We should prioritize the most vulnerable. Adaptation plans should prioritize helping people, places, and infrastructure that are most vulnerable to climate impacts and be designed and implemented with a meaningful involvement from all parts of our society. We need to build strong partnerships. Adaptation requires coordination across multiple sectors and scales and should build upon existing efforts and knowledge of a wide range of public and private stakeholders. We should apply ecosystem-based approaches. Not everything has to be about laying more concrete. Our natural ecosystems can help us reduce our own vulnerability to climate change, and we should incorporate that into our planning wherever possible. That we should try to find ways to maximize mutual benefits. We should use strategies that complement or directly support other initiatives, such as efforts to improve disaster preparedness, promote sustainable resource management, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and create jobs. The task force also recommended that federal agencies undertake some critical actions that are already underway, including mainstreaming adaptation planning across the federal government. In practice, this means that every agency will incorporate climate change adaptation planning into their operations and missions. And more than 50 federal agencies are preparing climate adaptation plans over the next year, and that will make adaptation an integral part of their work. And we should try to coordinate the capabilities of the federal government to support adaptation planning. And this is an explicit charge to federal agencies to improve the coordination of science and the services that they provide to state, local, and tribal governments, to communities, and the private sector. And that we need to address cross-cutting issues such as water resource management, human health, coastal systems, and fish and wildlife and plants. These are critical issues that cut across agency jurisdictions, political boundaries, and sectoral concerns, and we need to address them that way. We recently released a national action plan for managing freshwater resources in a changing climate, which includes a set of actions federal agencies should take to help freshwater resource managers assure adequate water supplies and help them to protect water quality in aquatic ecosystems. The task force and the agencies that make it up are reaching out to state and local and tribal governments to strengthen the partnerships around adaptation and to better understand and align our efforts. And like you're doing here in California, the Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force has focused on the impacts of extreme events and other climate risks to communities, businesses, and agencies. Extreme events that we're already experiencing are the most immediate and obvious clues to what the future could look like, and they're an immediate threat to our communities. And as you've talked about in this conference, we've concluded it's only smart to start by preparing for them. There's an important role that science plays in all of this. The United States Global Change Research Program, which has been in existence for more than 20 years, is conducting a national climate assessment, and then this next assessment is due in 2013, and it's looking at the impacts of climate change in U.S. regions, including the effects on public health, on the economy, and infrastructure. And this information will help to design adaptation plans and help us to prepare for the impacts of climate change. And one of the purposes is really to make climate science useful to communities. We don't have all the answers, but we know the past is not going to be a good indicator of the future. And we're still working on how to incorporate that uncertainty. Just as on mitigation, California's leadership will be essential as we work to resolve these issues and translate what we learn into useful information and advice to real people. So I look forward to seeing your efforts progress and for all of us to learn together. And I encourage you all to look at ways that the federal task force and the agencies that make it up can help work with you on these efforts. California certainly has a long and proud history of taking on head-on environmental challenges, and we look forward to working with you and working towards a healthy and resilient future for the United States. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Chair Sutley for flying out here and appearing today. And certainly we've heard a great deal this morning about the magnitude of the risks that we face from climate change. The increase, as noted by Chair Sutley, and the frequency and the severity of climate change events is just another set of wake-up calls that we need to do something now to combat climate change. As I've explained, however, this afternoon, what we really want to discuss is the proactive and positive work that's already underway in California and other areas to address these risks, and also to talk about what we can do collectively to address the problems of climate change across the state. We're very fortunate today to have a great panel up next that will share what's happening in communities and businesses across California to adapt to changes to our climate. These leaders come from a diverse group of sectors in the community, and they represent a very, very broad cross-section of Californians who are thinking about how we can best adapt to climate change. We're particularly excited to have a very dynamic moderator to lead this conversation. Heidi Cullen is a chief climatologist and research scientist for Climate Central. That's Climate Central, not Comedy Central, a nonpartisan institute that is studying climate change. Before joining Climate Central, Heidi served as the Weather Channel's first on-air climate expert and helped create Forecast Earth, a television series on climate change and the environment. She holds a doctorate in climatology and is a visiting lecturer at Princeton University. And I'd appreciate it now if Heidi and the panelists would come up and join me on the stage.
All right. Thank you guys so much. We're really looking forward to this panel here. And I was just kind of counting everyone up, and I guess we're one person short of a baseball team here. So we've got a lot of great expertise in the house. And just to give a little bit of background of how we're going to run this, the first part of this discussion is these folks just introducing what they do and how they're working within their own communities. And then we're going to open it up and have an interactive discussion and give you a chance to speak with them. And what we're going to do, you all have index cards in your folders. So I encourage everyone now, if you have questions or as we move along in this discussion, to write down whatever question you might have for the panelists. And we're going to have an usher coming around to collect these questions from you, and then I'll read them out. I have to say, when I was listening to this morning's discussion, I couldn't help but think of a quote that I've always loved by actually a hometown boy, Sherry Rowland, who was a Nobel Prize in Chemistry winner from the UC Irvine campus. And Sherry basically said something along the following lines, which is, what's the use of having developed a science well enough to make predictions if in the end all we're willing to do is wait around and watch them come true? And I think this morning you heard from, and I think this is a Latin word, the geeks, the science geeks, and I can say that because I'm one of them, basically talk about the long-term forecast. I mean, as scientists, I think that's what our job is, to look further downstream and just, make us aware of where our vulnerabilities are as a society. And these guys sitting here are the ones who actually are going to do something and not wait around for that forecast to come true. So to start off, I am going to just give a brief introduction of who we've got here. So I've got Patrick Levin. Sorry, you did that to me. You did that to me. Patrick Lavin. We were talking about his pronunciation, and he said, don't say Levin, which that's why I said it. I'm sorry. Patrick Lavin is the business manager and financial secretary for the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, IBEW Local Number 47. Mr. Lavin, see, I just did it again. No, I did it right that time. God, I apologize. Sorry. Mr. Lavin, it's so funny, I can't get over it now, has been a journeyman lineman for over 35 years. And he's a co-chair of the Council's Climate Change Adaptation Task Force, which took place in 2009. So he's got a lot of great things to say on the adaptation front. And I think a lot of what we talk about is going to be on the adaptation side. We're also going to hear from Major General David Baldwin. Major General David S. Baldwin is the commander of the California National Guard. And Governor Edmund Brown recalled General Baldwin from his second deployment to Afghanistan to assume command of the California National Guard. And as the Adjutant General, he leads the largest, most tasked National Guard force in the United States with an authorized strength of 23,000 personnel. We're also going to hear from Steve Frisch. Steve is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Sierra Business Council. Mr. Frisch is a former small business owner in the Sierra Nevada and former hospitality industry executive. The SBC has a record of promoting public-private partnerships which have leveraged more than $140 million in investment in the Sierra Nevada. We've also got Paul Wenger. Paul is a third-generation farmer who farms almonds and walnuts on a family farm in Modesto, which includes property purchased by his grandfather in 1910. He became a statewide Farm Bureau officer, serving as second vice president and elected vice president in 2005. He's on the CFBF board and chaired their water advisory committee. We've also got Martha Davis. Martha has led many of the agencies. She's with the Inland Empire Utilities Agency. She's the executive manager. And she's led many of the agency's award-winning conservation planning and green programs. Basically, they're looking at things like water conservation, renewable energy, stormwater capture. And basically, this is a utility that services nearly 1 million people in the San Bernardino region. Then we've got Ed Moreno, who's the Director of Public Health and a health officer in Fresno County. Dr. Moreno leads and administers Fresno County's health programs, including Office of Emergency Services in Central California. And he's working with emergency medical services, communicable disease control, as well as public and environmental health policy and planning. You'll note that planning is going to be a big part of what some of these guys talk about. We've got Nancy Fund, who's a managing partner with DBL Investors. Ms. Fund sponsors or sits on the board of directors of a number of private companies, including Primus Power, Solar City, Solaria, Bright Source Energy, and Pandora. Ms. Fund also worked closely with Tesla Motors, and I think she's going to talk to us a little bit more about some of the mitigation aspects of this. And then we've got Beth Gines, who's the Director of Sustainability for the City of Los Angeles. Ms. Gines is responsible for implementing climate change action in Los Angeles, and she's a founding member and city representative of the Los Angeles Regional Collaborative for Climate Action and Sustainability, which coordinates climate and sustainability planning for 88 cities, as well as utilities, transportation agencies, water suppliers, businesses, and academia, into a regional climate and adaptation plan for the larger Los Angeles region of more than 10 million people. So I think there's a lot of tremendous experience here. And, literally, I'm going to just kick it off to our panel. We're going to start with Patrick. And Patrick, I just love it if you can start by just telling us some of the most important things that we all need to be thinking about and some of the things that you're doing where you sit.
Okay. Oh, you can hear me. I can hear me. I'm Pat Lavin. I am IBEW Journeyman Lineman, card number D36819, in case anybody wants to file charges against me with the International. But I want to thank Governor Brown for asking me and the IBEW to be part of this. I think it's an important part for organized labor to have in this discussion. But I am not an expert. I'll give you the definition of an expert. Ex meaning former, and spurt meaning a large drip. So I think that'll explain that to you. So I will stay out of the expert part. But the good professor that talked earlier, the German guy, that's the funniest German I ever heard before. I mean, a German professor geek with a sense of humor, that's terrific. You can't get any better than that. But here I am the business manager of IBEW 47. Our largest employer is Southern California Edison down in Southern California, and we also have 6 municipal utilities. It's a membership of about 8,700. I'm also on the International Executive Council of the IBEW in Washington, D.C., and I represent about 143 locals in 10 western United States on that council. So we're always involved in the IBEW. Being a journeyman lineman, before I got all these fancy titles, I spent 33 years out in the field climbing poles, climbing towers, constructing substations, constructing generation stations. I worked at a few nuclear plants, doing the things that you do to construct, maintain, and repair electric utility systems, keeping the lights on so everybody can watch TV at night and make sure their microwaves run and that kind of stuff. We have many members who go out there in the rain and the cold and the snow and keep the lights on. So our members are always prepared. That's part of my job, making sure that the members of the IBEW that fall under our charge and our local union are prepared to do that type of work, to keep the lights on, to work long hours, to work in the rain and work in the mud and the snow and the other elements that aren't as pleasant as we'd all like to be all the time here in sunny California. But moreover, the IBEW, our largest employer, Southern California Edison, much to their credit, and the other utility, the investor-owned utilities here in California, have gone down the path to reduce their carbon footprint. Southern California Edison, to their credit, has put forth a thing with a motion with the PUC that they got okayed by the PUC a few years ago, where they are going to, they're in the process and well down the path of building 250 megawatts of rooftop utility-owned, maintained solar installations, which we're doing as part of an agreement with Southern California Edison. So to their credit, to PG&E's credit, that's got the same kind of filing, and San Diego Gas and Electric, those utilities are preparing for the eventuality of what we have to do here in California. I don't think that if we got to 100% renewables tomorrow, it would be very cost efficient. I don't think anybody would have any money left to buy any food the next day. But so we have to gradually get to where we completely reduce that carbon footprint. So, but the IBEW is prepared, our members are prepared, and we're going to try to help our employers and those utilities in California to get into that same proactive preparation state. I think that answers what you said.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm going to turn it then to Major General David Baldwin, and building upon what Patrick just said, what are you doing as the leader of the National Guard? I mean, with all of the extreme events we were talking about this morning, I'm sure you've been really busy.
Sure, and I'm actually, before I talk about emergency management, I want to follow Dr. Farrington and the Academy's lead, announce our own membership drive. So if anybody out there is interested in joining the National Guard, please come see me or one of my armed henchmen at the end of the presentation. If you do decide to take the plunge, you'd be joining an organization, the National Guard nationwide, that has a 375-year tradition of answering the call to help out our neighbors in times of calamity, to rescue people, to restore order, and to protect lives and property. Here in California, in the California National Guard, we're privileged and very proud to be a member of an intergovernmental and interagency team of emergency response professionals, firefighters, law enforcement, public utilities people, medical people, emergency managers, that have developed over time a model system for emergency response. That system was born of severe weather events, from wildfires in the 60s that brought us our mutual aid response system that the firefighters developed and the police adapted, to the Oakland Hills fires, which was, in my argument, an extreme weather event that caused tremendous loss of property, that resulted in the development of the standardized emergency management system, which has been adopted nationwide as, again, the model for how we do emergency response across the spectrum of governmental organizations and agencies. We are very, very good at what we do. So you can rest assured that here in California, we do lead the nation. We have the best emergency response system. The question that you have to ask yourself, though, and we ask ourselves constantly as we look at the ways that we can improve the way that we respond, the way that we improve that we can interact, the way that we can respond to the needs of the locals in times of disaster, is that system good enough? It's something that keeps me up late at night. Are we in the National Guard be able to respond? Will we be able to bring the forces to bear in the military to help the people in the time of need? Work very closely with Secretary Dayton from CalEMA, who does the same thing across the interagency to make sure we're ready to respond. And I would argue that as good as we are, and as good as we may think we are, in times of a severe weather event, a true catastrophic event, it's not going to be good enough, especially if you're one of the people that's in the impacted area and help is not arriving in 3 to 4 minutes like you're used to when you get a 911 call, but it may be hours or even days before help arrives. So my challenge to the leaders that are here from the business and government communities is you need first and foremost to ensure that your entity, be it a business or a governmental organization, has a plan so that you're going to be able to increase your resiliency of your organization in the wake of a disaster so that you can very quickly get your organization back on the feet and delivering its services through a continuity of operations plan. It's particularly important, in my mind, to the business members that are out there and those that represent the business community. Because at the end of the day, the recovery efforts need to be very heavily focused on restoring our economic power. The power of our nation is not the military. The power of our nation is our economic power, and you need to have a plan now to very quickly get back on your feet to deliver those services that help your neighbors recover and then also get the economy back going again. For all of the individuals that are out there and listening, you also need to be individually prepared so you and your family are ready to respond to an emergency. You need to develop emergency preparedness and response kits at home so that you can survive the hours or the days. And you have the supplies and the equipment on hand, radios, flashlights, food, water, and those types of things until help can arrive. Because help is on its way, but it may take us some time to get there. And finally, to continue to encourage you, just leave you with the thought of the moral of the boy who cried wolf. The moral of that story is the wolf is coming, so you better get ready.
So, Steve, the General just talked about the importance of the economy. What are you guys doing with respect to public-private partnerships, and what are you doing in that space?
Well, let me start first by saying that I do have a continuity plan for our organization, but I did it because our auditors told us we had to do it. Now I have an entirely new reason after seeing the presentations this morning. When I moved to the Sierra Nevada 25 years ago from San Diego, I have to honestly say I don't think I really understood how a forest works. And having lived in a forested landscape for 25 years and seeing the changes going on that landscape, you know, everyone thinks that they can sense and feel climate change personally. Well, I'm convinced I can. And it really led to me taking to heart what the poet laureate of the Sierra Nevada, Gary Snyder, says, that you have to find your place in the world and dig in. And I think what it's really going to take is millions of people finding that place and digging in. And what I discovered is as I started to repeat the mantra in our region that climate change is real, it's happening now, it's human caused, that we can do something about it, that there really are tremendous business opportunities that come from adapting to climate change, and new models of doing business that are going to be required, and real innovation that's necessary to do it. So across the Sierra Nevada region, not just within our organization, but led by organizations like the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, who are working on kind of developing these new models on the ground, there's really three primary things I wanted to talk about. The first is the idea of beginning to create value out of woody renewables. Really, we have a forested landscape that can provide habitat and species and ecological co-benefits, but also is a source of not just healthy forests, but also renewable energy and jobs within our region. And there are great projects going on up and down the range. Great example in eastern Madera County, the North Fork Combined Heat and Woody Biomass Project that is really kind of a flagship community scale, very small generation capacity, but really beginning in rural regions to put this distributed energy network together on the ground. Projects like that moving forward that are led by community collaboratives that really look at incorporating social, natural, and financial capital building in the community simultaneously. Another area that I think there's tremendous opportunity and that people have been designing new business models is really around this issue of planning in the wildland-urban interface. It's going to require new models of development in rural regions that include transit-centered development in rural communities. It's going to require small lot development and cottage-style development, firescaping around communities, and beginning to leverage that firescaping activity as feedstock for that woody biomass. And the third area where I think there's real opportunity, and I'm really proud of the leadership of the state of California, is in carbon sequestration. The development of a market mechanism to compensate private landowners for good forest management practices that sequester carbon, but also create all of these co-benefits: recreation, the habitat and species, water quality, all of the things that can really begin to get our forests that I didn't realize how they work to begin with to work properly again are incredibly important. I just want to mention one project there. I'm really proud of the point that we have one of the first forest management carbon sequestration projects listed with the Climate Action Reserve as of a couple days ago, the Harvigo Bear River Preserve in Placer County. So it's a small start, but it's an opportunity to start creating these market mechanisms that will feed into land management in the region. And by the way, the Placer Land Trust that led that project is committed to using local labor and paying local people on the ground to put foresters back to work in the region. So finally, I think that what we really need to keep in mind is to get this to work and to get the business community to really begin implementing these new economic models. We need to start looking at layering these co-benefits together so that they feed off of each other, and aggregately they create an economic model that will internalize those externalities that we've just taken for granted for hundreds of years. Since the birth of capitalism, we've taken for granted the point that we can externalize our impacts. And really by internalizing those externalities and making market-based systems that make them work, we can create new business opportunity out of that. And there are people all the way up and down the Sierra Nevada doing that.
It's an incredibly important point. And also with respect to just the jobs issue. Obviously all of this discussion takes place at a time when we're thinking a lot about jobs and the economy, and in many respects what we're talking about is reinventing the economy in some ways. And I have to say I really love that quote, "Find your place and dig in," which almost seems like a natural segue to Paul and talking about the California Farm Bureau.
Well, this morning I guess it's great. First of all, I want to thank Governor Brown for inviting us to be a part of this. And, as we talk about the whole extreme climate and what it's all about, and it's really the basic necessities that everybody needs. It's not the BlackBerries, it's not the computers, it's not the iPads, but you need to have water to drink, you need to have food to eat. We talked earlier about being the 8th largest economy in the world, and yet, depending upon whether it's on economic output or pounds of actual product, California is either the 5th or the 7th largest agricultural economy in the world. And the only reason we can do that is because of water. And so as I listen to the speakers today, it really creates more questions. And so I'm going to talk fast and throw some things out. First of all, I'm a farmer. When my grandfather came out from Pennsylvania in the early 1900s, we were in dairy. We went into the beef business. Today we raise almonds and walnuts. The 5th generation of the Winger family hopefully will be able to be on the same farm, even though we're close to Modesto. But my boys, I got 2 sons that are farming with me. Hopefully the 5th generation is 2.5 years old. Maybe he'll be farming vegetables. I don't know what he's going to be farming. But we're farmers, and so we will adapt. And so while we're talking about extreme climate changes, I deal with weather. Because weather can put me out of business tomorrow. It can affect whether I can stay in business and hand it down to the next generation. As we were talking about 2006, and I remember that well. I'm not sure how many of you remember it all that well. It was extremely hot. But as I saw my neighbors that were in a dairy business had cows peeling over dying, They were putting out great big water trying to cool down the cows. And Governor Schwarzenegger at the time, he went with us down into Fresno as we didn't even have a way to deal with the dead animals. The rendering facilities couldn't keep up, and so they had to deal with that. But yet, people thought about it, but did it really affect them? And when you think about the ravages of 2006, and you think about the people that really affected the most, it's those people that couldn't afford to turn the air conditioner on because they didn't have the ability to do it. And I look around this room and I think about it, and I think, if the cost of dealing with climate change goes up 10 or 15%, is that going to affect any of us here? Is it going to affect a lot of those people and the families of those kids that are walking around this facility here today? I take great pride in the fact that in California, or in the United States, Americans today, less than 7% of the disposable dollar goes to food. But for a lot of people, even in California, we have food deserts, and I think it's unconscionable. And so what happens if we do not continue to produce the food and fiber that we become and taken really for granted? When we think about our carbon footprint, arguably we have the most production of food and fiber for the amount of carbon footprint we put out. We can produce more calories for people to eat of a diverse nature that everybody wants to have. But what it takes is water. And so when we think about climate change and we listen to the scientists and they tell us that we're going to have less and less snow, it's pretty clear here today. We're going to have less snowpack and we're going to have higher rainfall events. What are we going to do to be able to capture some of that water? And sir, we can conserve, but you can't conserve what you didn't have. If you didn't have a bank account beforehand, so a lot of those families that are out there, when you talk about, we'll make that dollar stretch a little bit more. When you start out with $10, it's a lot better when you start out with $1. You talk about conservation. So what are we going to do in California to conserve? We heard about some talking about how we enjoy the great grapes and the wine that we get out of Napa and Sonoma. And that's true. Another speaker talked about, while we're also going to see warming events, we're going to see extreme cold events. So in 2008, we saw 24 days of degrees in the Napa and the Sonoma area where it was in the 20s. And so we had our vintners up there in order to protect their crops, and a lot of them, not only did they lose the crop, but they lost the entire vines from cold. And so they frost protected. But because there was some strandings possibly of some salmonoids, today we have regulations that don't allow them to protect their crops from frost. So do we want to protect them from warm temperatures, or do we also want to protect them from cold temperatures? And what it comes down to is water. And water is what has made this country and has made this state really great. I grew up in Modesto. When I go into Modesto, there's a sign that says, water, wealth, contentment, and health. And I know I'm in the Modesto Irrigation District. We partner with the city of San Francisco for the Don Pedro Reservoir. And so those that put that reservoir in, I think they knew what they were talking about. Because it started with water. Water, wealth, contentment, health. And when things get tight, we're all going to have to share in a little bit. And just one other thing I'd like to add is the water that you use today came through my property. It's called the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. During the drought in the 1980s, going into the 1990s, while everybody else in the country and the state was really cutting back on water, we cut back. That water continued to come here to San Francisco. Couldn't it have gone into a river so that fish could swim in it and it could have been part of the environment? We pull it out of the delta and we could desal some of it. And as I talk to folks from Hetch Hetchy during that time, they go, it drives up the cost of our water. And so again, it all comes down to a cost. So as a farmer, I guess what I say is, I'm a farmer, I'll produce crops. The market will tell me what crops I'll produce. We have the best ability here in California because of the diversity of our landscapes. It's not so much we're going to put farmers out of business, but there will be a shifting. But what we have all come to enjoy is the variety of crops that we produce here in California. When you think that 60% of the fresh fruits and vegetables consumed in the United States come from California, in the wintertime, 100% of the vegetables consumed across this country came out of the Salinas Valley. That is huge. And you talk about putting people to work. And we can continue to do it. It might shift a little bit, or it might go out of business. And the reason it's going to go out of business is if we don't have the water. And so we can provide the water, and we can provide the water for fish in the environment. We're going to have to do things differently. And I'll just wrap up that as I talk to people about water development, they go, reservoirs or dams are that's a 4-letter word. We can't have it because, it's going to affect the environment. And we got to make sure that salmon can live in a natural environment. How many of us in this room live in a natural environment today? We weren't born with the clothes we have on. We don't live under an oak tree or in a cave. We utilize transit that we were able to invent, and we need to help the environment, and we need to help the salmon. It's a miraculous fish that comes back from the rivers, comes up the rivers to spawn. But we can utilize those rivers to help people, and we can utilize those rivers to help the salmon. We have the technology available today to do it. We just need to get after it.
Yeah, I mean, it's so many good points there. And I think, we're talking about climate, but when you talk to a lot of scientists, they'll say that the single most important issue that they're concerned about is water. So when you talk about climate, you're talking about water in a lot of respects, and in many ways we're talking about competition for water. And in a way it's perfect, right? Because you've got the agricultural sector with massive water demands. And then, Martha, when it comes to the utilities, I'm sure that you guys are thinking about water as well.
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time.
Can we get her mic on?
Usually it just comes on. There you go. One of the messages from today, which has been pounded in over and over again, is the past is not the future. And I don't think you could string together for water managers a scarier set of 6 words. Think about it. Every facility we've designed, every projection on the adequacy of our water supplies to meet future needs, urban and agriculture and environment, every rule curve for flood management, based on what? Looking at the past 100 years and saying, how do we use that information to inform the future? And we're now looking at conditions of uncertainty that are so far outside that boundary of what we've imagined to be possible that it is scary, and I think the governor had it right. It's not complacency. It's being frozen in terms of what do we do about it. But water managers, whether at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, they're not stopping. You have to, when we talk about water planning, sometimes we talk about it so far into the future, we forget. These decisions are made on an annual basis. We have annual budgets, and we talk about how we're going to invest and plan for the future. We have 10-year capital improvement programs. And the kinds of things that we're working on right now, and I'm going to focus on actually at 4 top. One is we have to really think differently about how we plan. It's not hard, but it is different. We can't just take lines and draw them out into the future from the past and say that's what we can project. We need to do scenario planning, and there's some really exciting work that's being done through RAND, through DWR, through a number of water agencies. In fact, I brought, just to plug it, the Climate Change Handbook for Regional Water Planning that just came out in November. But it talks about the importance of the what-if scenarios, because if we don't ask what if, we can't answer the question of how do we better prepare for that future. So that's really important. The second is, and we talked about it a little bit this morning, the vulnerability assessments. Boy, is that important, and we do it all the time. And we need to elevate it into the discussions about how we plan for the future. I know as a water agency, and I'm looking with my team of people on the planning side, which pipes through our asset management program are going to get improved this year. And I can tell you that one pipe, if it breaks, okay, so what? Another pipe, if it breaks, it stops the whole water system. Which pipe am I going to invest in? And it's that kind of an assessment that we need to bring to the table in terms of looking at the implications of climate change. An example, the Bay Delta is our Bermuda Triangle of problems. And particularly when you look at that convergence of the levees and their vulnerability, the sea level rise, the impacts of flooding. In the 2009 DWR report on reliability, it estimates that if there is an earthquake combined with any of these disasters, it is possible that that system could be out of commission for up to 36 months, 3 years. How many people in California are actually planning around a scenario that says there's a possibility that I'm not going to be receiving all or some water out of the state water project for 3 years? Who's planning that future? So as we look at the planning scenarios, there's a lot of ways in which we need to think differently and figure out how we're going to anticipate some of the worst case scenarios. And sometimes it's an inconvenient discussion. Which city council member wants to tell its public that maybe there's a chance there's not enough water for the future? But in asking the question and thinking about what we can do about it, we then have the opportunity to really, in an informed way, make some choices that make a big difference. I do think it's important to take another look at how we're making our land use decisions. I think we've had assumptions that we've had a lot more control over nature than we really do. I think the discussion this morning about the importance of keeping people out of harm's way, whether it's in flooding zones, but I'll tell you another one that's a great example. The great work that DWR and Cal State San Bernardino did on the alluvial floodplain planning. Just recognizing that we are building in places where we have clastic flows in the middle of these arc events. Really important to figure out where are we putting people in harm's way. And the importance that the public doesn't understand the difference between a 100-year flood event or a 200-year flood event. They think because they've been permitted to build there and live there, it's safe. So we need to deal with the reality that sometimes our land use planning hasn't really caught up with the risk factors and the public's understanding them. Another element is watershed planning. We really haven't completely understood the ways in which the choices we've made to pave over stormwater and alluvial fans, or the choices that we've made in terms of constraining some of our floodplains, are now adding to the problems that we're facing. There's some really exciting work. Southern California is a great example, where they're actually taking a look at unpaving some of our areas, de-channelizing, trying to figure out how do we make sure that we're not losing stormwater that would go into the groundwater basins. Another area is diversification of our water supplies. We have a tendency to talk in terms of just certain types of water supplies. And some water supplies are actually more drought resilient than others. Reusing water, recycled water, capturing stormwater. There's not a drop of water that we can take for granted in California, and we should be moving forward with our planning with that sense. And you see the diversification occurring throughout California in the agricultural area, in the urban areas, where we are bringing on more and more water projects in our backyards, or we're restoring the health of ecosystems that have been impaired, whether it's up in the mountain counties, restoration of meadows and the roles that that's playing in improving the way the watershed functions, all the way to Southern California, where we're doing more to develop our local water supplies. And then finally, water agencies actually have a really important role in development of renewable energy. Moving water in California is energy intensive. It represents about 19% in total of all the energy use in the state. That's all the way to the end user. And so we have choices that we can make in how we manage those water supplies, how we are more efficient with the way we use our existing supplies. And the flip side of that coin is because we have the load, think about it, we also have the locations where we can develop renewable energy projects. We have the staffs that are professionals at running these kinds of operations. And there should be an initiative, and many water agencies, I see Sonoma County here, there's so many others, who are really looking at plans where, like my agency, we're planning to go gridless by 2020. We're making investments in solar. We're doing biogas. We're doing fuel cells. We have a key role to play in recognizing the energy intensity of our water supplies and making the investments in efficiencies and renewable generation that ultimately will help address the long-term reduction of the greenhouse gases. Thank you.
Well said. You know, Martha, I think you really nicely touched upon, in this notion of long-term planning, I mean, we really are touching upon the role of government agencies and the ability to look over long timescales. And as a climate scientist, I can't help but think about the fact that a lot of our water decisions were made in the 1920s based on river flow in the 1920s. And one of our scientists this morning, asked the question or raised the question of us moving into a new normal, and acknowledging the fact that our water supply the climatology has changed, and it's time to reimagine what these flows are going to look like moving forward. And, in many respects, it is, again, a natural segue to Ed, and in the sense that we have new normals that we're dealing with more heat extremes. The number of 95 and 100-degree days, for example, are going up. And one of the issues that the general public hasn't necessarily made the connection to is their own health. And that's been a really big area, I think, of needed risk communication. Would love to hear more about what you guys are doing in that realm.
Sure, thanks. And I want to thank the governor and the governor's staff for inviting me. We've heard today that climate adaptation strategies provide opportunity to innovate and create jobs. But what I'd like to stress today is that it also, I believe, provides opportunities to achieve some health code benefits. And with a little bit of time I have today, I want to focus on a few issues that I believe we need to take into account as we're developing these adaptation strategies in order to maximize the health benefits. But first, if I could also talk about 2006. It's been brought up several times, but I was in Fresno County and went through that extreme heat event. It was a significant event for us. I began getting, for 2 days, the heat index during the day was around 110 degrees, and at night it didn't get down below 80. And the reason that's important is because the human body needs to cool off and recover overnight in order to endure heat the next day. And for about 48 hours, we didn't have that. And when it was over, we had over 20 people that had died from heat-related illnesses. I'm also the registrar of birth and death certificates, so I had an opportunity to review the death certificates for the people who had died, and my staff had the task of talking to family members. And what we discovered was that just about everyone in that heat event that died were older adults, and many of them had chronic diseases. And they were also socially and geographically isolated in many cases. So that event reminds us that there are people in California and in the Central Valley who are more vulnerable to extreme heat events. And what we learned is that from a public health perspective, there are certain issues that I believe we need to deal with in creating these adaptation strategies to try to get as many health benefits as we can. So I want to touch on 3 of those this afternoon. One is the environment in which we live, work, and play, and how it impacts our health. Now, land use decisions, community design, transportation policies all influence the environment in which we live. And that environment, in turn, determines whether or not we have or do not have opportunities to be safe, healthy, safe from extreme heat. So one example I just want to point out is, for example, the air conditioning that was brought up. We know that during the hottest days in 2006, there were a lot of people who did not have air conditioning and suffered heat-related illnesses. And there were some people who had air conditioning, but the units were so inefficient that it was too expensive to operate. And I say that, and I bring that up is because we know that in California in 2006, some people were found dead in their homes with the air conditioner turned off. They couldn't afford or couldn't pay the bills. So we've made some progress. We know that PG&E does offer financial assistance, and we as a health department, during our heat response, we try to get that message out through our media contacts that there are opportunities to help defray the cost of electricity. So turn on the AC. Family members need to check on their older family members and if you have to go to the house, turn on the air conditioning and make sure that unit is running. But, of course, I think we can do more. There are new technologies and strategies to reduce the heat of dwellings during summer months. Those include, we should promote incentives to install cool roofs, which reflect the heat and allow the dwellings, either businesses or homes, to run more coolly and actually keep people healthier. And the other thing is we in Fresno and in the Central Valley are working with organizations, with planners and developers in the cities, and Tree Fresno is an example to try to get more trees planted to increase the tree canopy, which will reduce the ground level temperature to, again, keep the buildings cooler and keep people safer and less vulnerable to extreme heat. The second thing I want to address, issue I want to address, is that of water. And I'll take a particular example in the Central Valley. There are a lot of disadvantaged communities in Central Valley who are struggling to get reliable, safe, and affordable drinking water. And typically many of them are running off of aging and unreliable well water systems. And so this is important for extreme heat because these are the vulnerable communities in California. Because during extreme heat, if that one pump that they're relying on goes out, they have no water. They have no water to stay hydrated during hot weather. They can't run their evaporative coolers, which is one of the predominant ways that people keep cool in the rural parts of California. And they may not be able to maintain even adequate sewage and sanitation. So, again, these are issues that we need to deal with. Fortunately, there is some efforts, the integrated regional water management efforts in California, and in particular the Tulare Lake Basin has a grant from the state of California to work collaboratively to help these communities find ways to get more reliable, safe, and more affordable drinking water. And so the third thing I want to mention is the impact of chronic disease, which has been mentioned before, on people's ability to tolerate hot weather. We in public health believe that people who have chronic disease are more vulnerable to hot weather. A study that was just released this year by Dr. Kapman out of Central Valley Health Policy Institute showed a strong correlation between high ozone levels during hot weather and increased admissions to hospitals and emergency departments for asthma. So that type of evidence really is what is convincing more and more of us that, again, people with chronic disease like heart disease or asthma or diabetes are more susceptible during hot weather. So a couple of things that we know we need to do is try to, first of all, prevent or reduce the prevalence of chronic disease. And we do that by increasing access or better nutrition and access to better nutrition and increasing physical activity. So on the nutrition side, we actually have a working group in Fresno County where we have the Farm Bureau, and we have small farmers, large farmers, medium-sized farmers, and we have institutions like government and schools who are coming together to try to figure out what it's going to take to make it more profitable for the farmers to take the food that they're growing in the Central Valley and deliver it to us in the Central Valley rather than shipping it out of the state or out of the country. So we have a working group trying to do that to improve nutrition, which would decrease chronic disease burden, and also increasing physical activity. We have other work groups where we actually work with school principals and the neighbors in the schools to open up the gates to allow the community to use the playgrounds when the kids aren't in session, and even we've been successful in putting farm stands on some of these grade schools and elementary schools. So we've got things that we're doing, and public health is part of the solution to try to reduce the burden of chronic disease. And the last thing on that is that we also need to manage chronic disease a little bit better than we're doing now. There's a lot going on with the Affordable Care Act, but we also do have some on healthcare side. But we also have some funding now in Fresno from a federal grant will allow it's a community transformation grant, which will allow us to build our capacity to be more efficient in identifying people with chronic disease and better managing their chronic disease so that they are less vulnerable to extreme heat events. So I just want to end by pointing out that I think these are issues that we in public health would really like to see addressed as we all work together to try to work on adaptation strategies to maximize the health benefits of these adaptation strategies. So thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And mentioning air pollution and the link to chronic disease is almost, it reminds us that obviously California has still struggles with air quality issues. We know that they're going to increase as it gets warmer. Nancy, in your work with renewables, what kinds of opportunities are you seeing in that space?
Well, first I'd like to thank the governor and his team for bringing us together today to talk about these very important subjects. I just want to introduce one statistic. We've heard so many, we've learned so much today, and the statistics are a little bit challenging, but one I read earlier this morning, which I think people will be happy about, is that in the third quarter, just ending this September, more solar was installed in our country than ever before. 140% increase, 450 megawatts, which is about the size of a coal plant. And so our nation is in an energy transition. It's just, as in all cases of innovation, you usually don't see it when it's in its early stages. But there's no doubt that we are transitioning our energy supplies from a fossil fuel dominated one to the kind of statistics that we're now able to tell you about. Renewables in California offer an amazing way to mitigate climate change effects, but they also play an important role in adaptation. Just as Martha talked about diversity of water supplies, the diversity of our renewable supplies in the state is very important and gives us a tool to really address the issue that you have when you need to deal with extreme climate events. The distributed solar that we're seeing infuses more points of access to power across the state, whereas the large-scale desert solar really concentrates gigawatt scale in regions of our state that have different ecosystems, different climate trends than a lot of other parts of the state. So that diversification is very important in terms of protecting us from a particular event that's happening, extreme event, because it will insulate us a little bit from being 100% exposed with one type of energy source. And then, of course, next generation wind, which we're beginning to see come on the scene, is going to add to that diversification. You're going to see more efficient wind turbines. You're going to see more environmentally friendly footprints, and so we're quite advantaged as a state to have a diversification strategy in energy to address some of the problems that we have. Now, we heard a lot about the importance of protecting our electricity supplies, and that is critical. Our electric grid, the slides we saw this morning, is our grid system really was developed in the 20th century and needs, just as our telephone system evolved into the 21st century, so does our electricity grid need to do so. The good news is that there are a lot of software and service companies working with the Cal ISO, with the FERC, to develop the kinds of systems that will allow our grid to respond to outages, respond to extreme temperatures, to peak demand in ways that are much more efficient and real time than we have today. And that will protect us from some of the extremes as well as help us run more efficiently. We're also seeing energy storage come on the scene to allow our grid to accommodate more renewables in a more effective way. When you do have variable sources like wind and solar, where the sun can be covered by a cloud or the wind can cease to blow, you do run into some problems integrating that into an electricity grid. And California is really leading the way in companies that are developing cost-effective energy storage, which will allow, just as we need water storage, we need electricity storage, and it needs to be accessible price-wise. And we're seeing many investments in companies doing that, and many of them are in our state. So there's good news there. We're also, of course, leaders in this state in electric vehicles, and that's obviously a mitigation success, because in our state we have 40% of our carbon footprint is as a result of transportation, unlike the rest of the country. So it's a wonderful tool to fight that problem, but it's also a potential tool for helping with improving the strength and the responsiveness of our grid. Because right now, while you just go in and plug in your battery-powered car to charge it, without too much additional design and improvement of the grid, you would be able to develop a bidirectional charging structure where you could use electric vehicles to send power into the grid from the car batteries in times of need, or to address some peak issues, thereby avoiding the use of expensive and often more environmentally damaging peakers. So electric vehicles, in addition to having the obvious environmental benefits in transportation, can offer a very exciting dimension to our way of strengthening our grid to address the severe climate risks. And I think I'll close by just saying that another layer of good news in these kinds of solutions is that the companies that are developing these solutions, California is really leading the way. And these companies that are benefiting from the leadership policies that our politicians and state leaders are creating are really creating jobs that are quality jobs, that are available to not just PhD scientists, but to people from more modest means. And so the fact that in 2009, almost 180,000 jobs in California were clean tech jobs, and that's growing every day. One of our companies, Solar City, when we invested a few years ago, it's a rooftop financer and installer, they had about 25 people, and today they have over 1,200 people, and they just announced they're going to put solar in military bases across the country. That's adding another 750 jobs, and these are high-quality jobs with career ladder potential and very good employee benefits. So there's a huge economic development story to be told here in terms of the power of clean tech and environmentally sustainable businesses to address our very serious economic situation in the state. And while the extreme climate risks that we've heard about today do pose immense challenges for us, they also open up the possibility for very positive, creative solutions that combine the best of our policy leadership with our spirit and tradition of entrepreneurship and innovation.
Thank you, Nancy. And it is so important to emphasize the jobs angle here, because I think it's one of the stories that hasn't really been given the kind of airtime that it deserves. So we're coming to our last panelist right now, and I just want to remind everyone and encourage folks to write down any questions that they might have. We're going to go to questions after Beth gets a chance to talk to us about what she's doing in the city of Los Angeles and in a much larger area, in fact, with the adaptation plan that you're working on.
Yes, and thank you for inviting Los Angeles to come today and share a little bit about what we're working on in terms of adaptation and climate change. In addition to the California National Guard, cities are also first responders to the effects of the changing climate, and we're also on the forefront of trying to adapt to that changing climate. We have some recent experience with of extreme events. About 2 weeks ago, we had a huge windstorm, which you heard about earlier, that has put quite a dent in our forest in Los Angeles. We also had a fire about 3 years ago where we lost 500 homes in about a 2-hour period in the valley just at the north end of Los Angeles. We also have significant water supply issues. We rely upon water supply from Northern California for a good portion of our water. And it is pumped over the mountains and comes to us at considerable cost in both money and in greenhouse gas emissions. We also have 2 power plants and 2 wastewater treatment plants that are along the coast at 10 feet above sea level that already flood when we have high tides and storms. But Los Angeles' story is not an Eeyore story. It's a story of opportunity. And here's what we're doing. So we adopted a layered approach of work on climate change and on sustainability and adaptation. We're working with partners. We've teamed up with ICLEI, USCC Grant, UCLA, and the city departments on the development of an adaptation strategy for Los Angeles. The initial task is focused on sea level rise, and we're using sea level rise as a pilot project. USCC Grant has worked out a strategy for developing adaptation plans, and we're using sea level rise to work the bugs out of the strategy and to make certain that it works. So in terms of this project, we have assessed the vulnerability of city facilities to sea level rise. And we're going to take and we are in the process of developing a mapping of those areas that are most vulnerable to sea level rise and the areas that we need to either strengthen our shorelines, where we will need to possibly retreat from shorelines, where we will need to take specific actions to keep the beaches from eroding, and a number of other issues. So we've once we get the city departments have joined us, and once we get their plans in place, we're going to go out to businesses and to other communities in Southern California and ask them to join us in putting together this adaptation strategy. The regional strategy is very important to us. One of the reasons is because Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles, is only one of 88 cities in Los Angeles County. And what we discovered when we started doing our greenhouse gas inventories is we'd go and sit down with other cities and say, so what are you guys, what are you doing? And they'd say, oh, these are our goals. And we'd say, well, those are close to our goals. These are the kinds of reductions in greenhouse gases we want to make. And then we realized after about the third conversation that it's really just stupid for each of the 88 cities to do their own thing and to not coordinate. Right as we came to that decision point, Noel Perry of Next 10 showed up in Los Angeles and said, I have funding for something on climate change. What do you want to do? I will facilitate the startup and fund lunch for the starting of something on climate change. And so we eventually met with lots of different organizations, and we teamed up and developed the Los Angeles Regional Collaborative for Climate Action and Sustainability. The collaborative is housed at the Institute of the Environment at UCLA, but it's not owned by anyone. If the county owned it, the city would get tired of going. If the city owned it, the county might not want to go. If Metro owned it, maybe Caltrans wouldn't want to join us. LADWP is part of the City of Los Angeles, and they are front and center. So as part of the collaborative, what we're doing is convening regional discussions on climate and adaptation. So another funding miracle occurred right about the time that we got the collaborative organized, and that was the federal government came to us and said, here's $37 million in federal stimulus money that you can use on energy efficiency and climate change. So the county and the city, in an absolutely unbelievable meeting of the minds, decided to, the county is going to use $500,000 of their stimulus funding, or is using it, to develop a greenhouse gas emissions inventory for the entire region of 10 million people in 88 cities, and to develop strategies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They've used some of the funding to avail the region of some interesting new modeling that's going on at UC Davis of the energy from buildings. The city also agreed to use $500,000 of our funding, and what we've done is we have contracted with UCLA, with Dr. Alex Hall, who is one of the lead authors on the next IPCC assessment, and we're doing scaled modeling of the Los Angeles region, not the city of Los Angeles, the entire Los Angeles region, so that we can develop regional strategies for adaptation as well. The model that's being developed has two horizons. One is 2041 and the other is 2061. And what it will do is give us an idea of what Los Angeles will look like. What will our average temperatures be? What kinds of fire risk will we have? What's our June gloom going to look like? What are our Santa Ana conditions going to look like? And based upon that model, and it is a model, we will develop plans and policies, possibly ordinances, that will go into place to help us adapt to this changing climate. Now, whenever I talk about this model, and in groups like this, or where there's or several other climate scientists, they say, except for Dr. Pachuri, they say, oh, it's a model. And we know it's a model, and even if it's wrong, it has given us a place to start. We have a strategy for developing plans, and we are moving forward. And that is what we've seen has been difficult for a lot of communities. So we also have chosen to work on a regional level for another few reasons, and that is resources. The county and the city split the cost of planning that could easily have cost either one of them that amount of money, or worse, that we'd both spent $1 million on developing these models and strategies separately. And we would have just lost. So we've chosen to work on this on a regional level, and we invite anyone else in Southern California to join us. At some point, we hope to join up with similar efforts that are going on here in the Bay Area and also in San Diego. with the idea that maybe the three larger regions can get together and move forward on adaptation as well.
Thank you, and you guys heard that. There's an opportunity for collaboration. Yeah, and Beth, I'm going to give you a chance to rest for a second, but I want to come back to you because we've gotten several questions, many of them on the same theme about what can local governments do. And specifically one of the questions, Steve, I'm going to have you lead off with, which is what can local governments do to engage business?
Sure. Well, I think there's a real problem going on in California today with diminishing tax base. And because of the real estate bubble and the point that it takes, anywhere from 5 to 10 years really for that impact to filter through local government. I think what local governments are discovering is that there are a lot of services provided out there in the business community that they can actually take advantage of, that can deliver some of those services more efficiently. And I think we're beginning to see this emerge around things like scenario planning for growth and development, pre-identifying districts for transit-oriented development, and for kind of infill building and infill development, kind of creating a driver to take growth out of that, in the rural regions, out of the wildland-urban interface, and in the urban regions, out of that green belt around the cities. So I think there's a real opportunity there. But another important opportunity is to begin to get local governments to coordinate their resources and their objectives similar to what Los Angeles was describing. This issue of regional collaboration to meet mutual objectives is absolutely critical. And oftentimes the business community crosses over between those boundaries. They can act as kind of a network hub to help the local jurisdictions begin to talk to each other about how they can meet mutual objectives. And I would say we need this most on climate planning, but there are other areas where we really need it that overlap as well, like economic development planning in California. I mean, California doesn't really have a coherent economic development strategy that has bubbled up from the regions. And by looking at how economic development and climate adaptation can tie together, it's actually an opportunity to begin to bring these communities together, get more efficiency, less tax dollar to get the same outcome.
Yeah, I mean, it does really seem like leveraging efficiencies through collaboration is going to be critical in an environment like this. Beth, do you have anything to add to that? Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. But I would also add that we're also doing some things that are actually more directly involved. For example, with our stimulus funding, we have set up a commercial building retrofit program. Because PACE, we had a great PACE program plan, and as you know, it hasn't quite panned out, although we're still working at that for residential. We took some of our federal stimulus money and we used it to develop investment grade audits of commercial buildings. And then now the commercial building owners, once they have that audit, and we paid for the audit, it's about a $20,000, $30,000 audit. Gave it to the commercial building owners and said, here are some financiers that will give you a loan so that you can do the retrofits that are identified in the audit, and then you can pay the loan back through your energy savings. And we are just about out of funding for the commercial retrofit audits at this point. So we're hoping to get a lot of energy efficiency out of that, but it's also, it's also back to the point of you got to start somewhere, and trying to meet our businesses halfway is a big part of our strategy.
Yeah, and Nancy, I don't know, would you have anything to add, just from your perspective in the renewable energy space? How are you guys collaborating with local governments?
All the time. It's so important in this sector to understand what the policy priorities are and which agencies at local, state, and federal level can help your business plan thrive. And so I think it's taken a little bit of education from the venture capital community that isn't really used to working as regularly with the public sector, but it's critical because if you're not following and interacting relating to the policy objectives, you're going to waste, your investment strategy is not going to work. And so I think we're seeing the RPS, the million solar roofs, now the S-chip. I mean, there's all kinds of great policies that are now part of the lexicon of investors and venture capitalists in this sector so that we can use those precious investment dollars to create the strongest outcomes.
Thank you. Okay, and Martha, I wanted to ask you a question. One of the questions we got actually says that our panel missed something, so I want to make sure we get this question to you, and that is the role of NGOs. And the question is, can you comment on the role of NGOs as partners in accelerating efforts around watershed adaptation?
Sure. Let's just start with the point that we're all part of the watershed. And so whether it's the local government or the water agencies in the special districts or it's business, or it's what we call the non-governmental association, which I view as the community. We're all in this together, and as we look at ways in which we can improve or manage our water supplies, the first issue is water doesn't respect political boundaries. So we have to think about it in terms of a watershed perspective, upstream, downstream. And the choices that we make about how we manage the water, either through developed facilities or through our individual choices on turning on a tap or not, or letting the water run in your yard or not, go to the core issue that we're all going to have a responsibility for trying to figure out how to make these systems work. Now, there are really fascinating opportunities for all the different sectors, but the non-governmental association groups in particular, in terms of thinking about the programs where we can, whether it's water conservation, whether it's working with private landowners on land management choices, it comes down to being thoughtful about how we make choices and improve the management of these resources. And you'll see it in terms of things like the tree planting programs and shade trees. You'll see it in terms of communities that go out and help to monitor stream flows and water quality. It's choices we make about how we're managing the forests and on private lands and on public lands. But this collaboration piece is really critical because it goes really to the heart of all of us owning what the problem is and participating in the solutions as we go into the future.
I think there's another emergent trend that is really important that is starting across the country, and that is NGOs beginning to work together at a much larger scale to look at landscape adaptation planning. And examples of that in California, you see examples like the Southern California Multi-Species Habitat Conservation Plan, in the Sierra Nevada a partnership we're working with a number of other partners on called the Northern Sierra Partnership, where we're actually beginning to look at 5 million, 8 million acre landscapes and look at how these resource values are really integrated across the landscape and planning for long-term climate adaptation. So that conservation is not just about saving the perfect meadow or the park on the corner. It's about putting together a mosaic of natural lands that help our overall landscape adapt to climate change. Mm-hmm. And there's a new national large landscape practitioners network that the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge has put together. There are 75 organizations across the country working at this scale.
All right, and we've got about 5 minutes, so I've got maybe 1 to 2 questions left, and we've had a ton of great questions, so I'm going to have to skip some. But General Baldwin, a question for you. How is California integrating earthquake disaster risk with climate change actions? The question is, surely these hazards should be considered together. Are you guys looking at these hazards together?
In our emergency planning, and it's not just how we do it, but it's how the entire emergency response network does their planning now. We used to approach things from a threat base. How are we going to respond to an earthquake? How are we going to respond to a tsunami? How are we going to respond to an extreme weather event? Our planning now is all capabilities based. The way we approach it, it doesn't matter what the disaster is, whether it's an earthquake, a tsunami, a tornado, what have you. The consequences that come from that are how we design our response. So we design our response based on tailoring the right capability, whether it comes from the military, it comes from the fire services, it comes from law enforcement, is what's the right package that needs to go to help the people in need at the request of the local incident commander.
So essentially you can build the case that you're literally just looking at every way you can to keep people safe, regardless of whether it's climate or, a geological driven threat.
And to keep a lot of that to the minimum too. It's how those systems are planned, especially like the utility systems, whether it's gas or electric or water systems, how they're planned, how they're engineered to keep the effects of those disasters at a minimum.
Excellent. So I think this is going to be my very last question. I'm going to open it up to the entire group, and it just seems fitting. This is a question that came in from the audience, and it seems like a fitting note to end on, which is how can investments and actions to address climate change ensure that they also create quality jobs? Nancy, maybe I'll just start with you, because I kind of ended with you on the jobs note.
Well, I think the early returns are encouraging. I think that, for example, Tesla Motors, which when they start building in large quantities the four-door car down at their facility in Fremont, which used to be the NUMMI plant, will hire, they'll probably have over 1,000 jobs there. And those are very well-paying jobs. What we see when we harness the power of entrepreneurship with investment and accomplish policy goals is that along the way we create the ticket to the middle class for a lot of Americans. I think we saw this in our state back in as early as the 70s and 80s when we created the life science industry. Some of the bottle washers, the lab techs at Genentech used the salary and the stock options they got to buy their first home. I think you're seeing that in clean tech. You're beginning to see that as these companies grow, as they access capital markets, there is a distribution of the benefits, and that turns into a very virtuous circle in that you are creating jobs and wealth, not just for the top of the pyramid, but for people for whom this may be one of their first jobs, and really get them on a path of being able to save and derive the benefits of the entrepreneurial economy. So I think we're seeing it. We need to have a healthier capital markets profile globally in order to let some of these companies emerge. But I'm optimistic. You have to be in this business, and I think 2012 will be a real watershed year for clean tech. No pun intended.
Patrick, a quick comment, and then we're going to wrap.
Quick on the jobs, and I'm glad you said that because we are kind of the people that brought you both the middle class and the weekend. So I mean, we've created out of the greening of the grid here in California, just in our local union, there's probably been 600 full-time, good-paying union IBEW jobs that have come out of the installation of solar and wind and other types of greening of the grid projects that have gone on. But we want to continue to make sure that those jobs stay here in California and stay here in the home of the free and the land of the brave, and not get sent to Mexico or some of the other places where some of the companies are trying to access things down there. We need jobs here in America, and we need to keep jobs here in California. We can ill afford to have them go any farther offshore or any place to even buy some of that stuff that's being installed today. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, let's thank these great panelists right here.